And now we're going to move on to the first panel of the day. Global governance. What is it? How does it affect you? And what is its current shape? Welcome up on stage Inge Kaul, Adjunct Professor at Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Zheyu, Opinion Editor of Caixin, Global in China. Paul Dickinson, Executive Chair of the Carbon Disclosure Project. And Malini Mehra, CEO of Globe International. Oh, and I'm very happy to, you can please sit in whatever order you want, and I'm very happy to see that Paul Dickinson has been located. We had a bit of a governance failure finding you this morning. Thank you. Thank you. So, Inge Kaul, Michael Muller was describing the shape of global governance as many layers and quite a patchwork. Why is this the case?
Why it is the case, the mic correct, yeah? Let me come to the expression that we heard many times in the previous part of this session, the UN. I'm an old UN hand. I'm now at a university, but I have spent many years in the UN. And I want to simplify matters. The UN is building many buildings with conference rooms. And in these conference rooms, the states and civil society and business meet. And you cannot say, is the UN effective? Because we are just a building, but the decisions are being taken by the states coming in and influenced by civil society. So what the outcome is reflecting the power politics and the situation in the world. So if Mr. Trump says, no, I don't give money, what can we do? You know, even if other states say, no, we don't want this, we don't want human rights, we don't want this, nothing happens. That's one thing. The UN is a building in which states meet with other partners. The second thing is that whenever we have a decision, we are not, in the UN building, we are not a hotbed of innovation in only very exceptional cases, because often things trickle up, and when there in any case exists agreement to do something, like in the case of the Montreal Protocol, where we had the replacement for the CFCs and where we were ready, where the skin cancer was getting more and more serious in the US, where there was a strong self-interest on the part of a powerful state, then something moves. And then it trickles down. And therefore, I would also not take credit, as my colleague, the previous speaker, did. The better life today is not only to a small part, the result of UN activities. Mm. Because governments have a self-interest in large measure to promote development, to do better in health, to vaccinate the children. It's a sticky process the world over, but I think most of the credit goes to countries implementing what was discussed there. No doubt there is a thickening global normative framework, like on human rights, and one pushes back down. But I think it is really, one has to see the whole process as a loop, and often on the actors meet in the rooms that are on First Avenue or in Geneva or somewhere. So we can't point with fingers to the UN. No, you have to point to Ms. Merkel, to Trump, to whoever. They are responsible for success or lack of success.
So most of the progress that was pointed to earlier is due to national states implementing. So why should we care about global governance, Malini Mehra? Should we not just leave it to the professionals?
We certainly shouldn't leave it to the men and increasingly the women in charge, because we all have a stake in the United Nations system and global governance. I do want to unpack a couple of things, because I think it's blindingly obvious that the United Nations system is an intergovernmental system. Of course it is. And as a member of civil society and the other stakeholders, but in particular civil society, we have had to fight damn hard to get our way into these rooms. And I've spent many long years inside those rooms, in conference rooms. So it's not a given that we're going to be invited in. We've had to struggle to find a place at the table. The thing that I'd like to unpack is, what do we mean by government? Because I represent an organization of parliamentarians. These are elected representatives of the people. And yet within the United Nations system, which is member state-centric, but it's specifically executive-centric, you don't have the other members of the governance structure of a country. So you don't have the judiciary, you certainly don't have the parliamentarians. And actually, that's why my organization was founded. Because in the late 1980s, as we were building up to the first UN Summit on Environment and Development, the Great Rio Earth Summit in 1992, there was no scope for parliamentarians to engage with the United Nations negotiations. And so some very clever and committed people at the time, who included Al Gore, senators at the time, Al Gore and John Kerry, and their counterparts in other parliaments around the world, said, okay, we've had enough. We're going to form our own platform, and we're going to engage with this system, and damn well we'll be taken notice of. So that was where parliamentarians started to enter into the negotiations. And unless we're all part of the conversation, we will not be a part of the solutions, the decision-making, and most importantly, the implementation. So, come back to your question, we all have a stake in it, and we have to struggle for a seat at the table.
Paul Dickinson, very happy you're found. I'm going to hold on to you now so you don't get lost. UN created by national states for national states, but if you look out in the world today, you have companies that are as big as many national states, the large multinational companies. How does that change the system of global governance?
Well, it changes it completely, 100%. I mean, I'm very worried about mass extinction, but I'm most worried about the extinction of the policymaker, because I believe these men have killed the policymakers. And without the policymakers, then everything dies. And what we have to recognize is actually 70% of the 100 largest economies in the world are corporations. Corporations and private money.
Sorry, how many?
70%.
70%.
The World Bank. And as you go down, of course, the countries just disappear. The world is completely run by business. It's a big joke to think it's not. And the problem is that each time we go, for example, we talk climate change. Climate change. A lack of political will. There's no lack of political will. Nobody wants to die or their children to die. What happens is you go and you put gasoline in your car, you pay quite a lot of money, and quite a lot of that money, a large proportion, a certain proportion, goes to absolutely guarantee there will be no political will. So we pay to endanger ourselves, and you can tell that I think that's the absolute thing that needs to be fixed. And just to be a little bit positive, working with people like Matt Sanderson, other investors at the UN, investors can get together with governments and say, hey, it is completely corrupt to interfere with the political process to guarantee national security. Get your money out of our politics.
And what else can we do about it?
Well, I think, honestly, after that, everything takes care of itself. The scientists get to go on TV. The heads of state can warn us how serious it is. It'll be tough. We'll have to change electric cars. We might not be quite so rich for a couple of decades, but it'll be beautiful.
It will be beautiful. Okay. we will get back to that. Young Zheyu, so the most important, probably, bilateral relationship today is the one between the US and China, which is certainly changing global governance all over the world. What impact does that have, and how should we understand it from a Chinese perspective? I know you have prepared a little statement or some remarks on this, please.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't speak fluently English, so I wrote something. It is somewhat boring, but I try my best to read it in short time. Let me begin with the recent trade war between China and the US. During the past 3 months, Washington threatened to impose tariffs on additional 100 billion worth of Chinese imports, and Beijing said it would fight back at all costs. Fortunately, after several rounds of dialogue, two countries reached an agreement to avoid the trade war and to stopping threatening to raise tariffs against each other. I'm not sure whether you pay close attention to the dispute or not, but the unprecedented quarrel between China and the US has been a topic in China's media. Just now we look at UN. China and the UN is two permanent members of the UN. So this bilateral relationship will, to great extent, to shape future global governance. I believe that the essence of the bilateral relationships is complex, both competition and cooperation. I stop reading it. Before I went to this forum, I read a report by the famous think tank Rand Company about China's role in current international order. The prediction is of this report is the current order is just. It is questionable. But I agree with the report is that in many fields, China and the US can cooperation. For example, dealing with climate change, and in IMF. But in some field, there will be some conflict, especially military field. So the future of the bilateral relationship will depend how the country will manage the disagreement. In fact, what most I want to point out is that China should cultivate a tendency toward a healthy national attitude rather than a tendency toward loud confrontation. Otherwise, the Chinese government will be backed into a corner if a trade war should erupt. Chinese people should be proud of the great achievements made over during 4 decades. But on the other hand, as China's power has been increasing dramatically, and Americans, we call them our teachers, made a serious mistake that led to the global financial crisis. Some of Chinese become more and more conceited, even arrogant. The mindset is harmful for China's further growth, considering it is still a developing country with about $9,000 GDP per capita in last year. I believe China has much to learn from the US. China claims that its economy is market economy about 30 years ago. But in fact, we have not, fortunate or unfortunate, we have not experienced a round of economic crisis. We have just I said we should keep open-minded to learn from the US and the other advanced countries.
So dialogue,
Yeah.
very important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Malini, you work in China as well. Would you like to comment on this and how the rise of China is changing global governance?
I mean, the relationship between the G2 is greatly speculated on around the world, and certainly in my own country, in India. I think one of the really interesting things is that, number one, China and the US were both original signatories of the UN Declaration and the UN Charter. People forget that. So I think most people don't realize that the great growth phase of the United Nations in terms of its membership was in the 1960s. And why was that? Why did this start from an experiment that involved originally only 51 countries? These were the original signatories to the UN Charter. Well, it was because of decolonization. Countries like my own won under colonization in 1945. And we saw that great growth period, which eventually led to 193 member states now. Now, arguably, two of those most important states, the defining states, China and the United States, both are very, very different in terms of where they are in their energy transition, their economic development, etc. And what I think is fascinating as someone who goes regularly to both countries is the way in which there is such a healthy dialogue and partnership on technology and innovation. And so if you just look at electric vehicles, the top country for electric vehicles is China, followed by the United States, and followed very peculiarly by Norway. Now, why is it that China has made such a game of electric vehicles and technology in general? Number one, because there's a very clear-sighted recognition by the leadership that environmental pollution and climate change, but in particular air pollution, is a significant destabilizing force in the country, and they have to manage their transportation and air pollution challenges. They also have put a huge amount of energy behind investment in technology. So if you just look at two statistics which really speak to why China is taking off in the way that it is. So in the US, car ownership is something like 3/4 of the population own a private vehicle. In China, it's 1 in 10. And it's a diminishing number because the Chinese government is disincentivizing having a private car, which is why the rates of car sharing are the highest in the world. And which is why you've got companies like Didi, which is run by a woman, Jenny Liu, which have basically thrown Uber out of the country. Yeah, so there is an incredible amount of innovative energy which is coming from China, and I would love to see some of that innovation also apply to the political sphere, because that's where we need it most. We need it within the Security Council, because as Mr. Muller said earlier, and to paraphrase you, turkeys do not vote for Christmas. Yeah, the Security Council is not going to be voting for its own demise. So we have to make sure that energy, ideas, and a political will to make that change comes partly from within and partly from without.
Thank you. Inge, Kaul, if I understood you correctly earlier, global governance only works when national interest and global interest overlap. But then Paul Dickinson comes in and he says it's all about money anyway. What do you say about that?
Yeah, let me continue the UN story that I started. If I say it's mainly conference rooms, then of course, by implication, the consequence of saying that is that if we want to have better global governance, then our thinking has to change, our policy making. And what is going wrong with policy making today, whether it's at the national level, at the regional level, within civil society, within business, or among governments? There is a very simple thing that goes totally wrong. It wouldn't occur to any entrepreneur to start building a pencil without thinking through what are the components he or she has to mobilize to get a pencil together. Talk about a more difficult thing like an airplane. You know, the way we all, whether civil society, parliamentarians, everybody today, how we deal with the so-called global challenges is that if you think of an airplane, 1 year we buy one wing, 10 years later we buy the second wing, we put it all on the tarmac, maybe we buy a few tires and a few seats, and we put it also on the tarmac. And after 15 years we say, oh my God, you know, poverty isn't reduced, nothing changed, that plane doesn't fly. We put more new things on the tarmac. So we go from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in 2030, we will have another round of some goals. What is going wrong is that we call things like climate change, financial crisis, the communicable diseases, that we just in a bland non-committal way, refer to them as challenges. Oh, there is a challenge. No, yeah, global warming may challenge you, you may feel hot, you know. But what you really want is to produce a global public good, climate change mitigation or climate stability. What you want when you think of Ebola, not today do a little bit, vaccinate one person, give something else to another person. No, you want to preferably eradicate it. So we have no understanding of the fact that many of the challenges we face actually require producing a global public good. And the term even is sniffed at, you know, global public good. What good is it, Mr. Bolton said to me, if it is global and public? So, but, and in governance systems at the national level, at the regional level, everywhere, we are still organized geographically or by economic sectors. But climate change needs to pull, mitigation needs to pull thousands of threads together. So we need a global issue focus. Or for global health, communicable disease control, you need a global health focus. Now, I did empirical studies, and the World Bank has done them too. We came to the same results. China, wonderful as far as clean energy is concerned, or India, well, other things. But why do they do it? Out of national self-interest, as you also said, and to the extent that global and national interests overlap. And then it's finito. In Germany, we retreated from climate change mitigation. Oh my God, we would have a little unemployment in the coal industry. So no, it wasn't in our interest, so we retreated. And what we find is that the sum of what we are individually and collectively willing to do for global public goods, like the ocean health or so, does not add up to this meeting the systemic integrity requirements of these goods. And therefore we never get there, crisis mount and multiply. And therefore my solution, if there is room, and actually we have the room, we have the trusteeship council would be there. I think what has to happen is not more parliamentarians, not just more civil society, not more states, not more business, no more additional human interested human beings with their own interests and individual interests around the table. The problems themselves should come to the table. So my governance innovation suggestion is the creation of a global stewardship council where biodiversity is represented, where the ocean is represented, where financial stability is represented. And then they can say, now you middle-income countries, how can we provide these, or low-income countries, high-income countries, how can we provide these goods so that their systemic integrity requirements are met? But sovereignty also doesn't suffer, and the only way to do this is fairness. Pay a proper price for international cooperation, make cooperation really pay and enhance national, local conditions. And that is where we fail, and I blame primarily the conventional powers, because we are stingy and sticky. Rather than saying we have a lot of intellectual property rights, we should let them go. You know, why must the holders of these property rights earn higher rates like the Deutsche Bank pays to their shareholders? No, let the technology available go so that we get the problem solved. And the same applies to the medical field. So if you had, and of course, I mean, biodiversity would be presented by a human being, but that human being would not come with his or her individual interests of one sort or the other, but really would stand up for the longer term, for the ocean health, for financial stability, and sort out how one could find a GPG provision that is sovereignty compatible, and how to change the exercise of sovereignty so that it helps in the production of global public goods. And one last sentence. The world over, in most countries, we have stopped in the morning to open our windows and just throw our night things out of the windows, what we used to do in the Middle Ages. But as states, we still spew our garbage across borders, the pollution and whatever, the toxic financial products. We have to have a responsible exercise of national policy-making sovereignty. Then we would have less under provision of global public goods. And if then action is needed, we have to come to a fair deal. And a very last remark. I think that international cooperation should be looked at as a political market. And that market is not embedded in norms. You have power politics, arm twisting, just walking away. All things that we would not do in economic markets. So my proposal is this new thinking. Think not of just challenges, think in terms of global public goods and their production, then bring the problems themselves to the table and just say fairness, fairness, it should pay, and I'm pretty sure we would be able very easily and quickly solve many problems.
So a big exercise in policy making. Paul Dickinson, but the policymaker is dead.
Well, not in China, actually. In special circumstances in China, the policymaker is alive and well. But, you know, really, the United Nations is a wonderful institution. United Corporations, we're waiting for United Corporations. And, you know, I do love corporations. I wrote a book in the year 2000 called Beautiful Corporations. You can see where I'm coming from. But you know, those you love, you're also able to study in detail. And I want to just draw attention to this notion of lobbying asymmetry. That is to say that something like 98% or 99% of people involved in the extraordinary social science experiment called the modern corporation, which in less than 100 years appears to be running most of the affairs of humanity, the midwife to the great technological revolution that still seems to be just beginning. That organization, 98% of them are all on our side. We all agree about what should be done, don't we? We all agree. It's not difficult. The key point is how to change it. And the point is no one, the people whose product is going to be taxed or regulated, they feel pain. They reach in their pocket and they pull out lobbying dollars, euro, as much as they need to stop the pain of policy, which is why the policymaker is dead. And all the right-thinking companies and people in business, they do not, they kind of conceptually know, but they don't put their hand in their pocket and put the money down. So we have this, the money is all against regulation, as we've seen particularly with the Trump disaster, but also with our own Brexit. The UK Independence Party had a policy commitment to abolish the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The patient who doesn't like their temperature, they break the thermometer. Okay? There is a sort of high degree of radical national, it's a sort of, you know, it feels to me a little bit like a cult, like a nihilistic cult. We need an ecological security council which is going to use the authority of governments, of investors, of business, of the military if necessary, to call out the extreme danger of lobbying to subvert public opinion. A final comment, I think, is another beautiful dawn, spring, time of spring, flowers. A beautiful spring flower is the citizen recognizing that they control this whole system in a certain sense, and how we invest our money and how we spend our money gives us sovereign votes in the whole system, and that power is just beginning to be felt.
In what way?
Well, you know, the internet is a great friend. I'm a director of a company, and sort of not-for-profit company. I have no financial interest in it, called Geeky, G-I-K-I. It's got an app, and the App Store only works in the UK, but it's got 250,000 products you can read from a barcode and tells you about the company behind the products. At CDP, we came up with a product called Climetrics, with support from the European Union, that ranks the carbon intensity of the 3,000 largest funds in Europe. There was never a better time for entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, to come forward and use the capabilities that we have now to unite our influence through our investments and our purchases, to break out of this deadlock, because it's not that complicated.
So we can make our money vote for a different system.
If we don't make money vote for a different system, we won't get one.
We won't get one. Okay. I'm going to turn to Marcus and see if there are any questions coming in.
questions coming in through hashtag GCFNSF. From the audience, you can also use this hashtag if you want to ask questions. So let's start with two. One of them from Ben Herrick via Twitter. I believe national goals must drive global governance choices. To what extent are these aligned across the world? In what areas are they the most different? And then second one, how is the sort of your view of the UN Security Council, how has that been affected by recent wars in Syria, Yemen, etc.?
Okay. Do you want to start?
Oh, yes. Can I just quickly, in the spirit of having a dialogue amongst ourselves, just come back on Paul's point? I've worked as a policymaker, so I would hesitate to suggest, even agree with
that you're
your
dead.
suggestion that policymakers are dead, they're very alive and well. I think what is moribund is political leadership. And I think that I absolutely agree with Paul when he talks about campaign finance reform. I think it's bigger than corporations seeking to influence. That's a long history, that's the human condition. People with money will seek to influence the outcome of political decision-making. But we are in a very, very disturbing situation now, where with the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in the United States, effectively you can pay however much you want for whoever, and you can totally pervert and subvert the political process, okay? You're gonna live past this, don't worry, Paul. Okay, so we need to get to grips with that, and I think we're going to have some really good discussions here on this subject about how we safeguard our political democracies. And yesterday, we had the most wonderful kick in the face by citizens against the Bannon influence, the Mercer influence, the political chicanery by the Russians, by whoever else, and that was the Irish referendum. So I hope you've all been watching the news on this. This was such an intensely interesting issue, not just from the point of women's reproductive rights and health, but because it showed the way in which globalized migrant contact, human contact, led to this significant reversal of policy. So you had an Indian woman, Savita Ramalapapar, who died in a hospital in Galway because she was forced to carry a baby, she was pregnant, which was not viable. She died tragically in 2012. She wasn't even Irish, but she died because in Ireland, the doctors would not perform an abortion because they were against the 8th Amendment. So this set off a lot of national soul searching, and it resulted in the decision that we had, which was yesterday, on the liberalization of abortion laws in Ireland. Now, the whole process of coming to that decision was subjected to such skullduggery in terms of seeking to influence the yes vote or the no vote. But as one of the people on Twitter, you know, I read this wonderful thing and it made me cheer, said that we are a lot smarter than Americans. We basically saw through all of that. And I think that that has been so important for safeguarding our democracies, because now we've seen what happens. We've safeguarded ourselves from being dulled into accepting those kinds of manipulations of our political process again. So hopefully that will get us through the next, the next set of elections. And my God, yes, having lived through Brexit, I'm waiting for the second referendum next year. Okay,
good luck.
So coming back to the point about global governance, how does it affect us? And I think it does, because I spoke about a national example and the question was about national plans, okay? And it is always about the national level, because intensely this is about national politics. National politics are hard enough. What's really, really tough are local politics. So I sit on the Mayor of London Sustainable Development Commission, and my God, is it complex. City of 8.6 million people run by 33 different boroughs. Everybody has a different view, and this is just one global city. You try and aggregate that to try and get in consensus at the global level, and you realize it always all starts local. It's all about getting a local voice and taking your role at the table, at your local school, who runs your national health system, who runs your council, etc., getting involved there. Because by default, what we have done, and I come back to this as a civil society activist, is that we have, because we have not been able to secure local voice, we have gone to the next level, and the next level, and the next level. And the further up you go, so you go to the United Nations, you then become so detached from what's happening at the grassroots. And bridging that, the cockpit view from the worm's eye view is, I think, a real challenge. This is a challenge of political leadership. So coming back to what can we do at the national level, I think political leaders need to make a case for certainly reforming the and renewing the United Nations, because it's the only system that we have. You know, in Churchill's famous words, you know, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest.
Thank you. So the second question about the Security Council and the war in Syria. Inge, Kaul, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would like to see that we turn away from the sort of security focus that has emerged in previous, in the last few years, and just let it be. Much more important is to ask, how do we, as we heard in the opening speech, how do we get climate change dealt with? How do we settle that problem? Yeah? And you cannot bomb CO2 or use bombs to achieve climate change mitigation. You don't need it for that. So why don't we crowd out the agenda and let the conventional powers get used to the fact that we are now living in a more multipolar world, and that we have to accept, we have legal equality of states, but by now we also have de facto equality. And the industrial countries find it very hard to get used to everybody being more de facto equal also. So we should get used to living in a multipolar world. And if I don't want my policymakers to come home from Geneva or New York or elsewhere and having gotten cheated, why would someone from Laos or from South Africa want their policymakers come home and have been pulled across the table and cheated? No, we want fair international cooperation. And some countries have more capacity and more resources and more obligations to take corrective action. And I wish that civil society would pronounce this more loudly. There are many other challenges. They all have to be dealt with, the women and the abortion and whatnot. But we need to focus on the key challenges and get used to calling them global public goods and produce them.
I think we have time for, there was one question from the audience, a gentleman here on my right.
Doesn't see anything.
Caixin Yu from Bondable Biopolymers from USA. Yeah, my question is, my question is, UN, talk about the UN, powerful one give up power, and worldwide put up results together, but immediately, the error paradox in the way. The error paradox states there cannot exist any rational procedures of aggregating individual preference into a social preference. Simply speaking, if we don't get rid of a tribal mindset and move on to common mindset, we cannot achieve anything. Without solving error paradox, Brzezinski's humanity program failed, and Reagan trickle-down program failed. So first, we have solved these problems. Before you answer that question, I'll propose mine. I think this topic for today is global cooperation. For that, we should first learn the nature and root cause of problems and solution for it. My proposal is nature of global cooperation is rational global actions guided by common mindset through which individual preferences are aggregated into a social preference. Root cause of the problem is tribal mindset, dominate clash interests. Solution is through direct factor, new way of thinking, discover social law and trending, which shape common shared interests. Common shared interests
Thank you.
shape common mindset. Common mindset shapes new global cooperation.
So your question is about how to translate individual preferences into collective goals.
Tribal mindset.
Tribal mindset, exactly.
I have an
Okay,
answer to
yes, Paul has an answer, so that's great. Here you go.
And I think at the heart of it, and thank you for the question, At the heart of it is a sense of responsibility, which I think is going to play out over the next 100 years, maybe all our politics for the next 100 years. Is my responsibility national as a citizen, or is my responsibility global as a citizen? And if we can work that out through education and a change of consciousness, then I think we may well get there.
Inge, do you want to add something? Last words?
Yeah, I would come back to fairness.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that we have, by now we have more shared values than we had in 1945 or so, but still preferences vary, you know, depending where I live, who I am, and so. And if we want to achieve a point of common willingness, shared willingness to act, you have to compensate me if I'm the hesitant person, and I shouldn't do this with bad intentions that I hesitate, but I may have good reasons. And therefore one has to, I mean, I pay for the jacket. I didn't steal it just out of the shop. You know, I paid for it. So why do we pay when it comes to private goods, and why don't we pay for inputs to global public goods? That's a
Young Zheyu, do you want to? Do you have any last comments?
I think the global governance, just as UN and the WTO system, is experience a period of uncertainty. What's way out? We can just wait for time to give us the answer. Experience all kinds of conflict, cooperation, and I believe we will build up a new global governance.
Thank you. And Malini.
Yeah, just 3 quick things. I think, first of all, one can't be at a forum in Sweden and not mention Dag Hammarskjöld.
Thank you.
So I think for those of us who are great supporters of the United Nations, with all of its flaws, warts and all, that a figure like Dag Hammarskjöld really acts as somebody who you go to again and again for inspiration as to why it was that this man, who was a public servant, decided to devote his relatively short life to the integrity and growth of the organization, and tragically lost it while serving as the Second Secretary General of the United Nations. But I want to just, a little bit of history also. So Mr. Muller mentioned to us a couple of occasions when the Security Council actually did act. It acted on the Iraq War, the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. But one of the things that most people forget in the dim and distant history of the United Nations is that it acted also convincingly and unanimously in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea. And of course, we're looking around us right now at the consequences, because this is the age of consequences of that. And of course, the 1950 decision was remarkable because it was a unanimous Security Council decision. It was at the beginning, the emergence of the Cold War. And I should not say this because this diminishes the force of the argument, but actually, the reason it was unanimous is because the Soviet ambassador was not in the room. The Soviet ambassador was absent, and as a result of that, they could make that unanimous decision. But it does show that where there is a will to act, the Security Council can bring the force of international law down. We need to see a lot more decisiveness. Now, I want to end with something positive, because we spent so much time talking about the catastrophe of climate change. We haven't spoken about the Paris Climate Agreement. Damn it. So, have to talk about the Paris Climate Agreement because it was something which was so disruptive in terms of the general orchestration of these international agreements. Paris was a complete maverick, and Paris brought us all together. And we actually have now, as part of the implementation program, we have the Tialona dialogue, which the Fijian presidency is taking forward. We have a stake in the implementation as the 4th column, right? Of course, governments, it's all other stakeholders. So we are now implicated in the implementation of the single largest unified global effort in all of our human history to deal with the climate challenge. And that is a wonderfully inspiring enterprise. So hurrah for that.
Hurrah. So we end with Doug Hammarskjöld and a hurrah.
no.
Sorry, Inge, we have to end because...
The Paris Agreement was the biggest flop that we ever...
And we can continue
can
this
I explain why?
in 10
Because
seconds.
it totally gave up on the obligation and international to cooperate and said, oh, you just decide voluntarily what you want to do and bottom up. No, this is a shameful agreement.
We can take this outside.
No, Paul has four words. 4 words. I will be counting.
But it gave us hope.
But it gave us. That's 5 words.